Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Friday, November the 28th, day after Thanksgiving. We've been having a football week, or what Europeans call football, Americans call soccer. We've been celebrating a wonderful new book, The Soccer 100, the story of the greatest players in history, co-authored by Oliver Kay and James Horncastle of the excellent Athletic. Earlier this week, we had a conversation both with Michael Cox and Amy Lawrence, both of whom are, for their sins, Arsenal fans, talking about the greatest players of all time. And we went backwards and forwards on Maradona and Messi and Di Stefano and, of course, Pele. But today, we're going to look at the other end, at the defensive end. We always talk about great goals and great goal scorers. But my guest today, James Horncastle, who is Serie A correspondent at The Athletic and the co-author of Soccer 100, is an expert on Italian football. Of course, there have been many great creative Italian footballers, but I always think, James, that Italian football is most distinguished for its defenders. The two who particularly come to mind are both listed, I think, after Beckenbauer. They're the most highly rated defenders on your list, Paolo Maldini and Franco Baresi. You're an expert in Italian football. What is it about Italy, given its flair, its outwardness, its creativity, that makes Italians such great defenders?
Yeah, I do think it doesn't really fit with the overall perception of Italy as a country. I mean, you just mentioned it there. Italy is, famous for its beauty. It's called Il Bel Paese, the beautiful country. Some of its most recent Oscar-winning film, La Grande Bellezza, The Great Beauty. And yet, Italy and Italian football has, for the most part, been about winning ugly, and has identified itself, certainly for, I would say, between 1960 and 1990, with a very gritty, rearguard, defensive style of football. And, you have some columnists and kind of op-ed writers from the 1960s who really believe this reflected the Italy that emerged from the war. An Italy that had been sort of devastated by kind of German occupation from the Allies, then landing in Palermo and moving up through the country, and the country kind of being left in ruins and having to kind of not having much from 1945, and really having to pick itself up and live in austerity. And the football reflected that austerity, sort of very pared back style of football in terms of whoever their opponents were, will let you have the ball, will be quite minimalist, and we'll win the ball back, we will counterattack, and if we get one chance, we'll score 2 goals. That's very, very much.
I mean, you talk about winning ugly, but I wouldn't describe, certainly Maldini or Baresi, they weren't ugly footballers. They were just incredibly brilliant defenders. I mean, to be a great defender doesn't mean you're ugly. They weren't nasty in the way in which I don't want to cast any illusions about Argentinian defenders, especially since Maurizio Pochettino wrote the introduction to your book, and he was a particularly dirty defender. But they weren't dirty in the sort of gruesome way in which Argentinian defenders have a reputation for. They were just brilliant defenders.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the two defenders that you've mentioned stand out, Andrew, because they were on a countercultural team, really. They were part of the AC Milan team. In Paolo Maldini's case, from 1986 all the way up to 2009.
He was a god, Maldini, wasn't he? I mean, it was an absolutely remarkable footballer. I mean, maybe not a god in the way in which Pele or Messi is a god, but there was just something sort of post-human about him.
Yeah, Andrew, I think, again, when we started this conversation about defending, I made the point about Italian football largely being the opposite of what Italy itself stands for in terms of being this great place of beauty, fashion, creativity. But Maldini does, he is everything that people would expect of a almost Italian film star. He's got the look of a very handsome Italian, and plays up to that.
And he played like it.
Exactly.
Yeah, he could have been walking out of a Visconti movie, or just
precisely. And Paolo is an extraordinarily gifted and elegant defender as well, who played left back. And I always remember him saying that because of that, people thought he was left-footed. He wasn't. He was playing on his wrong foot all the time. He was right-footed, and yet, did anyone really notice that? I think the fact nobody noticed that he was playing on the wrong side is really testament to the mastery of his craft and that elegance.
It's the technical quality of some of these players, Maldini particularly. Was this intuitive? I mean, I don't want to keep on bringing up Maradona, but in my conversation, particularly with Amy, we talked about him as the quintessential street footballer. Where did Maldini and Baresi learn their craft? Did they grow up playing football on the streets?
So very different backgrounds, Andrew. I mean, Paolo Maldini comes from a dynasty. Really, his father, Cesare, played for AC Milan. He was the captain of the first Italian team to lift the European Cup.
Yes.
And that was at Wembley against Benfica. And Cesare himself was, a very elegant libero. Someone who would sort of play behind the initial defensive line, sweep up, but also then step out with the ball. Someone who is known for being very capable with the ball.
So in the Beckenbauer.
Exactly. So there is a genetic inheritance there, and certainly, I mean, Paolo Maldini comes from a big family,
and he's got a son who plays as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. But I think it's remarkable with Paolo because he was one of the eldest, I think, of 5 children that Cesare bore, or his wife bore. But the first three were girls. And so Cesare, I think, kept trying because he wanted a boy. And his boy surpassed him. I mean, there was this, Paolo tells this story about how when he was first enlisted, AC Milan, the club his father had captained and was considered a legend, he was always known as Cesare's son. And Cesare would be on the sidelines watching Paolo play. And, within a few years, Cesare remarked, well, he's gone from being Cesare's son, I'm now Paolo's father. People have kind of forgotten everything that he did in the game because, Paolo distinguished himself, winning the European Cup 5 times.
James, you're an expert in Italian football. You've lived in the country, you know it inside out. When we think of English football, of course, we think of social class. It's the working class game. If Paolo Maldini was part of this aristocracy, I don't think there's any equivalent in England. The greatest defender, Bobby Moore, came from the working class. Is there the same association with class politics in Italy? I know that some clubs like Lazio have a right wing, a radical right wing element, and maybe we'll talk about Francesco Totti's politics later. But does it have the same class divisions in Italy, the game, as it does in England or perhaps in Argentina?
No, I would say certainly club football is more drawn on kind of political lines. I mean, you mentioned Lazio and Lazio's association, or the association with their fan base with right-wing politics, in some cases far-right politics, and I think that is a function of Italy, particularly being in the kind of 1950s and 60s. Kind of arguably the hottest front of the Cold War in Western Europe, where you had the biggest communist party outside of the Iron Curtain was in Italy, and for that reason, you had a lot of, I'm not going to say U.S. interference, but the Americans certainly didn't want the Communist Party to become the governing party in Italy, and so you had a lot of political tension in Italy, political terrorism in Italy, which meant the identification with extremes of politics was much stronger there, for example, than it has, I think, ever been until recently, maybe in the UK, and so I would say how you identified yourself politically was stronger than how you identified yourself in terms of class.
I know you're a Roma fan. Does that make you a leftist, James?
Well, I wish it was that simple, Andrew. Because
at least you're not a Lazio fan. That would be. I might not have you on the show if you were Lazio.
No, but I mean, even that's become very complicated. It's actually a story I'd really like to write, because, I mean, Lazio were founded in 1900. So they are 27 years. They predate AS Roma. They predate fascism and the March on Rome, which happened in sort of 1920. AS Roma were formed in fascism by a fascist. And someone who's been rehabilitated recently by the current government headed by Giorgia Meloni, who wanted the founder of Roma to be on a stamp. And yet Lazio are associated with, particularly the far right, far more than Roma. Now, look, Roma drew their fan base from working class, blue collar parts of the city. Neighborhoods like Trastevere, Testaccio, where people who traditionally voted left come from. More recently, where if you went to a Rome derby and you looked to the right and you'd see the Curva Sud, where the Roma Ultras stand, you would be able to see left-wing iconography in there. And if you looked left, ironically, to the Lazio end, you would see right-wing iconography. Now all you just see is right-wing iconography in both ends.
In our show with your colleague at The Athletic, Michael Cox, who wrote the piece on Alfredo Di Stefano, we talked about the way in which Franco in Spain, I think in some ways orchestrated the appropriation, almost the kidnapping of Di Stefano from Barcelona to Real Madrid. Was Mussolini, I mean, Italy won the first two World Cups. Did Mussolini get involved in politics? He got involved in lots of other things.
Mussolini certainly, when there are moments of sporting glory, be it in boxing, be it in athletics, be it in football, he wanted to be associated with that glory. Certainly he wanted an athletic nation. in the way that some other fascist parties in Europe at the time sort of really placed a great emphasis on breeding a strong nation. Weirdly enough, the last time there was real investment in Italian infrastructure, sporting infrastructure, was in those 1930s under Mussolini, and this is one of the stories why Italian football in the last 10 or 15 years has kind of become less competitive. It's because their stadium infrastructure, which was built in fascism, has been crumbling, and they can't make money from it in the way that Premier League clubs make money from their stadia, or the two Spanish clubs, Real Madrid and two big Spanish clubs, Real Madrid and Barcelona, have recently spent $1 billion or more than $1.5 billion on their stadiums. But yeah, certainly Mussolini, I don't think while he was a football fan, he would, if it was expedient to him to be associated with success, he was there. I think a lot of the stuff you see on social media these days saying that Mussolini was a Lazio fan is far from the truth. Mussolini was...
So the Lazio guys are claiming Mussolini. Of course, Berlusconi, who in some senses, particularly in his media savvy, is Mussolini's heir, was much more intimately involved with football, being the owner of a Milanese club. So the politics and the football often go together. We've talked about Maldini and Baresi, who sort of go together like, I don't know, what two things go together in fish and chips in English terms, James. The other two things that go together, and these are the second and third ranked goalkeepers on your list, are Dino Zoff. I grew up with Zoff. And then Gianluigi Buffon, who is another kind of god. What is it again about Italians? Yashin is the top ranked goalkeeper on your list. I think he's in the teens, but he's a sort of mythical figure. One wonders whether he really ever existed, a Russian goalkeeper. But these two Italians really did exist, Zoff and Buffon. Do they fall into the Maldini Baresi category of just being masters of their craft? What is it about Italy that produces such remarkable goalkeepers? There's a very good one now playing for Manchester City too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Yashin, Andrew, because he is ranked higher, and I scratch my head at this because no one who has contributed to the entries of this book were around to see Lev Yashin. They, as you say, have grown up with the mythology of him, and they've seen him win he's on the Ballon d'Or winners list. He's won the best player in
he was in the 50s, I think.
In the 50s, and I always remember I interviewed Gianluigi Buffon for the first time maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and Gianluigi's come close to winning the Ballon d'Or. He came closest in 2006 when Italy won the World Cup. He made an extraordinary save on Zinedine Zidane in the final, and he gave me a kind of geopolitical answer as to why Lev Yashin had won the Ballon d'Or. He was like, well, it was to do with the Cold War at the time. Sort of you were moving on from Stalin to Khrushchev. There was this kind of thaw going on in politics between the West and the Soviet Union. And so almost as a way to kind of try and help reintegrate the Soviet Union, it's like, well, okay, let's celebrate their best player, Lev Yashin, and give him the Ballon d'Or.
That's remarkable. Not just a brilliant reflection on Buffon, but on the intelligence of. I'm not saying that all Italian footballers are as intelligent or as historically aware, but one can't imagine Wayne Rooney or Paul Gascoigne giving those kind of responses, can one?
No, in those two cases, no.
I guess Maradona as well.
Well, with Maradona, he was someone who was very. I think one of the things that is so fascinating about Maradona, and for me, he'd be the number one. Is he transcended football like few other people? And spent some of the later years of his life. I think it was the 5th year of the anniversary of his death, just a couple of days ago. Later years in Cuba, hanging out with Fidel Castro and and Hugo Chavez, sort of smoking
So he was
cigars.
a man of that. And one could argue, James, since you've come out for Maradona at number one, one could argue that Maradona was an Italian. Of course, he most famously, certainly in the Italian terms, played in Naples. There was a wonderful obituary to Maradona by Ed Vulliami of The Guardian, who lived in Italy during the peak years of Maradona. And after, tells this wonderful story and I'm quoting him here, on the evening that Napoli Football Club won its first ever championship, and this was because of Maradona, first ever in May 1987, a graffito was scrawled on the walls of one of Naples' leading cemeteries, and it said, you don't know what you've missed. And overnight came the reply, who told you we missed it? Which is classic Naples. But there was and Vulliami said that Maradona's football befitted a city steeped in magic. He played like a voodoo shaman, and Naples understood exactly. There was I don't know if it was an Italian quality to Maradona, but certainly a Neapolitan quality, wasn't there?
Yeah, certainly a Neapolitan quality. I love Ed. He was sort of one of my mentors when I first started at the Observer Sports Monthly. Just a fantastic.
And a character as well, Queen's Park Rangers and Liverpool, right?
Yeah, some of his experiences as anyone who's read his books, I mean, just incredible reporter and just incredible life story. So,
he had a girlfriend, I think, in Naples. That was the way he used to go down there. He was the Guardian's man in Rome, a very romantic vision.
Yeah, but I think it's hard to imagine Diego playing for any other big Italian club. I think he found the exact right place for himself in Naples. Naples is, for me, the most South American city in Europe. It has a real magical realism quality to it.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I never thought of Naples as Latin American, but you're right.
Yeah, and I mean, in Argentina, they had the mythology around the porteño, the peep d'oro, the kind of angels with dirty faces, and in Naples it's sort of similar. They have this cult around the scugnizzo. The scugnizzo is the kind of artful dodger, who sort of lives on his wits and lives with his creativity.
Which is quintessential Maradona, isn't it? Both on and off the field.
Absolutely. And so, as much as Juventus wanted to sign him, and the great patron of Juventus, Gianni Agnelli, the kind of Fiat dynasty, I wouldn't say he never forgave his chairman at Juventus, Gianpiero Boniperti, for discouraging him from signing Diego Maradona. Because back in those days, Fiat had big factories in Argentina. People would
but one wonders whether Maradona would have actually flopped him in Turin at Juventus in the same way as he flopped in Barcelona. Maybe it required him to go to a place like Naples to actually prosper.
Absolutely. I think Naples was the making, not the making of Maradona, but it kind of played. It allowed him to be the best version of himself,
and the worst.
And the worst, it's
given the drugs and the mafia and everything else. You must have seen that wonderful film about Maradona by Cadia.
Yeah. No, it's to use Dante, it's Paradiso, it's Inferno in the same place.
So James, before we get into any more of the plays, how did you? I know you're a Leeds fan. You're born in Northern England. How did you get into this? How did you become such an Italy maven? You clearly are in love with Italy. I mean, generally probably with Italy, but certainly with Italian football.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, I love Italy, Italian culture. It's. I mean, football is such a big part. I don't think you can understand Italy without understanding Italian football. Because so much Italianness manifests itself through Italian football. I mean, for me, I grew up in Hull, which is a port city in the northeast of England, which sort of was going very
not distinguished for its football generally. Although the team did have a brief period in the top division.
No, and you've touched upon it exactly, Andrew. Because when I was growing up, Hull were on the brink of going out of business and out of the football league, and so I would turn on the Channel 4, the terrestrial TV channel in the UK, which had bought the TV rights to Serie A, the Italian league, when Paul Gascoigne moved there, because Paul Gascoigne moved to Lazio, and it was a move that was delayed by a year because he played in the FA Cup final for Tottenham and tore his knee ligaments. And so this documentary team followed Gascoigne around for his rehabilitation. And at the end of making that documentary, Gaza turned to the producers and said, "It's going to be really sad that nobody in this country can watch me play in Italy, play for Lazio." And so that gave the producers of that documentary the idea to buy the rights to the league in Italy. And then for the best part of 10 years, Italian football was on free-to-air television in the UK, just at a time when the Premier League, the English league, was going on to satellite pay-per-view TV. And so it was easier to watch Italian football at that time than it was English football. And Italian football was considerably more glamorous and better than English football at that time.
Which is weird to think. The reverse is true now. But
absolutely. So for a kid growing up in Hull, which at that time had been sort of voted the UK's worst town 2 years in a row, and had a
which is quite an achievement.
Yes. Yeah, I mean,
because it has many competitors, I think.
Yeah, to go back to back was a badge of dishonor for Hull. And this is another incredible thing, Andrew. On a Friday night, my parents would take me to an Italian restaurant in Bond Street in Hull, which is very different to Bond Street in London. There was this very miserable Italian patron who was a Juventus fan. And in his restaurant, there would be like a Juventus shirt on the wall. There was all the iconography of the '94 World Cup. So I remember seeing this terrible painting. It was a montage of Luciano Pavarotti, the World Cup trophy, and Roberto Baggio. And all of these things kind of captured my imagination, really. Offered me a window into a world that I didn't know but wanted to know more about. And yeah, I've been hooked ever since. And when I finished university, I moved straight to Rome, and I lived there for 5 years. And then the remarkable thing for me in my career was the person who presented the TV show that I grew up watching on Channel 4 about Italian football. He was starring another TV show about Italian football.
This is James Richardson, right?
This is James Richardson.
Another of the great characters.
Yeah, a great character who did such a good job in selling the culture of Italy to people. Someone who the initial idea behind this TV show on Channel 4 called Gazzetta Football Italia was that Paul Gascoigne would host a highlight show every Saturday from his garden in Rome. Now, it became fairly clear to the producers of that television program after one or two attempts that Paul Gascoigne was not going to be able to present that show. So,
is that because he's Gascoigne, or he was Gascoigne?
Yeah, I mean, sort of larger than life character.
I mean, the funny thing about Gascoigne, actually, again, I'm looking through your list, Gascoigne is the closest thing to Maradona that England's ever produced, for better or worse. And he's not on your list. It's rather sad, isn't it? He probably should be. I mean, had he not got that terrible injury in the cup final playing for Spurs, he might have got on the list. He certainly deserves to be on the list. I mean, you probably have endlessly argued the list, James, but he certainly deserves to be on the list more than Alan Shearer, of all people.
Yes, and because we started this conversation talking about Italians and defenders, but the things that the position I think Italians love the most, and is the most veneration for is the number 10.
And and you're writing a book about, would it be fair to call Roberto Baggio the quintessential number 10? Can we call you the Roberto Baggio of Hull, James?
Well, I'm not going to.
You'll take it. I mean, I wouldn't reject that one.
I will take it. Anyone who's seen me on a football pitch would disavow.
Well, certainly as a journalist, maybe not as a player, but as a journalist, you're the Baggio of Hull.
Yeah, I mean, Roberto. First things first on Paul Gascoigne. For Paul Gascoigne to be chosen by Lazio at that time to be the number 10 of Lazio, I think when Serie A was the best league in the world, where the best players played there, I think that was recognition of how great a player Paul Gascoigne was. To move on to Roberto Baggio, I mean, again, Roberto is one of the reasons why I do what I do.
And you're writing a book about him, right?
I am, yes. And, Roberto, the World Cup in 1994, for example, England did not qualify for that World Cup. So not only did I not have a club team, because Hull City were kind of going bust at the time, but my national team, England, were not going to be at the World Cup in 1994. And the drama of Italy's journey to the final had a real operatic kind of quality.
Well, I mean, I was actually I think it was the round before the quarterfinal, the game they played. They almost lost to Nigeria in Boston, and I was at that game. I mean, they weren't a great side, really, were they?
I mean,
it's certainly not a classic Italy side like in, I don't know, 1990.
No, to watch. Certainly not, Andrew. I mean, I've watched all of those games because I'm writing this book, and they were quite hard to get through, a lot of them. And that was the big disappointment around that national team, because they were coached by Arrigo Sacchi, the guy who was turning Italian football on its head from being a defensive country to an attacking country. But that never translated into the national team. And he wanted that team to play as a team and not be what other Italian national teams had been, which is let's defend really well, keep a clean sheet, and then get the ball to the number 10 to create something. That was the antithesis of what Arrigo Sacchi wanted. But how did Italy reach that final in 1994? They had to lean on Roberto Baggio to grab Italy by the scruff of its neck and drag them all the way to the final. And that Nigeria game that you were at, Andrew, I mean,
they were very lucky. I remember I usually support Italy, but in that game, I really felt sorry for the Nigerians, because that was about Africa's best chance of actually winning a World Cup, and the Nigerians were superior to the Italians that day, I thought.
Yeah, undoubtedly, and yet it's a moment from Baggio which kind of takes it away.
Let's talk. So Baggio, how good was Baggio?
I think Roberto.
I mean, he's in the 30s on your list, so he's certainly considered one of the greatest Italian footballers.
Yeah, I think.
My wife's coming into the room now. She has this great story, James. She was a student in Florence, and one day there were riots on the streets, and the police were everywhere, and she was trying to go to class. And she's a sports person, but she wasn't following Fiorentina, but the reason for it was that the Fiorentina board or management had decided to sell Baggio, so the whole city had erupted in anger. So she tells that story. He was a pretty good footballer, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think Roberto is arguably the most talented attacking player that Italy has ever produced.
Wow, that's. I mean, and then that would include he's better than Rivera or Riva, who are also on your list, less well known because they're older. But
yeah, I think for Italians, let's say you get a really good cross section of Italians who were there for Riva and were there for Baggio. It comes down to Riva and Baggio for them, because Riva, who was a striker and had the great nickname given to him there, it says Rombo di Tuono, the thunderclap, because when he used to hit the ball, it would make such a thwacking noise. It was like the heavens had opened and something incredible was happening. Riva, still to this day, is Italy's all-time top scorer. And he has a very low, well, I say low, he scored 44 goals for his country, which, considering Ronaldo has scored maybe, maybe more than 100 for Portugal. Harry Kane scored more than, I think, 60 for
Harry Kane isn't even on your list, which is one of my bones to pick with you.
Right, okay. But I think for Italians, when they talk about the greatest player, and it's interesting how in our list we have the defenders higher. We have Maldini and Baresi.
Yeah, and the goalies I think are higher. Certainly Maldini, I think, is the top-ranked Italian player on the list. I think he's 18 or 17. Baresi, and then the two goalies, Zoff and Buffon.
I think there's a very strong argument for, given what Italian football represents, or the perception of it, for Maldini to be considered number one. But in Italy, I think it's between Roberto Baggio and Gigi Riva. And I think what makes Roberto special is that he played for all the big three clubs. He played for Juventus, he played for Inter, he played for Milan. He was considered good enough for all of them. But he left those clubs to go and play for Bologna, to go and play for Brescia, because if he wasn't playing as much as he wanted at those big clubs, he wanted to be playing every Sunday so he could play for the national team. The national team always came first for him. And so, because Roberto scored arguably one of the most iconic Italy goals, which was in the 1990 World Cup against Czechoslovakia, where he picks up the ball on the halfway line, he dribbles past 6 or 7 players and scores. And then in the 1994 World Cup, he drags Italy all the way to the final. There was this feeling that Roberto always gave his best for his country. And one of the great sort of injustices, not just in Italian football, but in Italian life, if you, judging by the reaction, was in 2002 when Roberto was towards the end of his career. He had another horrendous knee injury, which I think is one of the limiting things in his career. He had so many knee injuries. His career really never should have got started, because he, as a 16-year-old, he had a terrible knee injury when he was coming through at Vicenza. But in 2002, has another one. This was in February time, and he does everything. And he has what is a record recovery from an ACL tear. I think it was something like 60 days. And he did that to be ready for the 2002 World Cup, only for Giovanni Trapattoni then to say, Roberto, I'm not taking you to the World Cup.
So, okay, you've made the Baggio case. What about Riva, though? What's remarkable, when I was growing up, he was my favorite Italian footballer. I mean, what is astonishing about him, not only, as you say, scored more goals for Italy than anyone else, but he played in Sardinia for Cagliari, and they won the league against, in these big, and at that point, the two Milan teams, Juventus, Roma, Lazio. So isn't that a remarkable achievement? Doesn't that make him really astonishing, both in national and in club terms?
Yeah, I think so, because Sardinia now is a place that people go on holiday, and people go to the Costa Smeralda, where the Aga Khan sort of invested a lot of money in the 60s, and it became a destination. But certainly when Gigi Riva went there, Sardinia was a place where you would send the carabinieri who have been particularly bad, and you want to teach them a lesson on discipline. Sardinia was not the place it is today. It was bandit country. And Gigi Riva goes there and wins the league, the one and only time that Cagliari, or a team from Sardinia, a team from one of the islands in Italy, has won the league, and dedicated his life to Cagliari. Lived there until his dying day, and very taciturn. Gigi Riva, quite, I wouldn't say reclusive, but like someone who, only. He didn't want to make new friends, and so, I mean, again, Gianni Agnelli, the Juventus patron, he tried to do everything to convince Gigi Riva to leave Cagliari to come to Juventus, because Agnelli always wanted the best Italian players to play for Juventus, and would say, look, I'm going to build a Fiat factory in Cagliari. I'm going to invest in infrastructure. So it's not just a transfer fee that I'm paying you, Mr. President of Cagliari. It is, I'm going to make the whole island better. And Gigi Riva said,
he said he didn't have as good a hair as Baggio. I think that's for sure.
No, I mean, Roberto also maybe benefits from having one of the great football nicknames, which is the Divine Ponytail.
Which is appropriate because he did have a divine ponytail. In our conversation with Amy, James, she argued that Maradona dominated the 86 World Cup more than anyone else had ever done in history. But could one argue that the 80 World Cup, Rossi, who's on your list, Paolo Rossi, also dragged Italy to winning that competition? That was also remarkable for the 82 World Cup.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know how good a player he was, but that tournament was astonishing. And I think he's in the 60s on your list, which is quite an achievement.
It is. And, working on the book on Roberto Baggio, you go to the hometown of Roberto, which is Vicenza, which is in the Veneto. So it's near Venice, but it's between Venice and Verona, and people kind of forget about Vicenza. They don't go to it. They'll either go to Venice or Verona. You go to Vicenza, and there is a big tower block there. And on the side of that tower block is a big mural, not of Roberto Baggio, of Paolo Rossi. Because Paolo Rossi played for Vicenza. He gave some of his best years to Vicenza. They finished runners-up in the league under him. That's sort of what gets him this move to Juventus. But he gets caught up in a match-fixing scandal, which kind of Paolo Rossi kind of always denied being aware of the fixes going on within the team. But I think there was a desire to make an example of a big player. He has this very long ban, and basically doesn't play for a couple of years. But the coach of Italy, Ezio Berzot, says, Paolo Rossi is my guy. I will wait for him, and does wait for him. And at the beginning of that 1982 World Cup, a lot of people questioning Berzot's judgment because he didn't score until the knockout stages. And then
I remember that. I think in the group stage, I don't think they won a game. Didn't they draw all their games? And they were all 0-0, I think.
Yeah, and so
they were terrible. And then they suddenly, in that amazing game against Brazil, and didn't they beat Argentina as well? I mean, it's just an astonishing tournament.
And that's the thing. So I think there were two group stages in that tournament, and the second group stage was much harder because they had Argentina and Brazil.
That's clear. And how many goals did Rossi score?
Well, I mean, Rossi is scored 6 goals in that tournament, but I mean, it's the hat trick against Brazil,
right? But they were all at the end. Yeah, astonishing. We got to. I know you don't have all day, James. A couple of other things before we go. There are other creative Italians on the list. Totti, I mentioned, for perhaps notorious in some ways for his politics. Del Piero, Pirlo. Do any of them, very briefly, how would you summarize their positions on the Soccer 100 and their place in Italian and football history?
Well, I think with Totti in particular, I mean, I lived in Rome through his kind of, I wouldn't say his best period there, because it was after he'd won the league, and they hadn't won the league since 1984 when he won it in 2001. But Totti is a very particular individual because, I mean, he's from Rome. He spent his entire career in Rome. I think a lot of people don't understand or don't appreciate how gifted a player that Francesco Totti was, because he stayed. It's very strange to hear someone say that Rome is a provincial city when Rome is Caput Mundi, the capital of the world. But it did withdraw into itself, and it does feel like you can be living in a village sometimes when you're in Rome. if he'd said yes to Real Madrid on a couple of occasions where Florentino Perez, the Madrid president, wanted him, maybe Totti wins the Ballon d'Or, maybe Totti wins the Champions League. But instead, he chose to give everything to Roma. And that meant he was, in some respects, mollycoddled and became the kind of the king of Rome, if you like. But it means that if he's not as high on the list as he probably thinks he should be, it's because of that decision which people love him for, which was
Should he be higher? I mean, out of Totti, Del Piero, and Pirlo, who is the best of the three?
I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think Pirlo and Del Piero would say Totti.
Oh,
but just because, like, Francesco, he played two finals for Italy, the Euro final in 2000, which Italy lost in extra time. And Francesco believes that had they won that tournament, he would have won the Ballon d'Or. In 2006, he does win the World Cup, scores a very crucial penalty against Australia. But I think on his day, I think Del Piero and Pirlo would say that Totti was the more gifted player. Pirlo might have something to say about that, but I think those two, I think, would probably back Totti.
I mentioned, finally, James, I mentioned Maradona being, in a way, the spiritual Italian, or certainly a spiritual Neapolitan. There are other players, though, on your list also who never would have been great without their experience in Italy. You're a Leeds United fan. Yeah. The most famous and greatest of all Welsh players was John Charles, who famously played for Juventus. There's also Van Basten on the list, one of the great Dutch players after Cruyff, who played for one of the great club sides in history, AC Milan. What is it about Italian club football that bring out the greatness of players like Charles and Van Basten? We can think of Rijkaard too. I mean, there are other players, other great players who played in Italy during the glory years, less so now, of course.
Well, I think particularly with John Charles, we mentioned how Italian football really between 1960s and 1986 played this style of football called catenaccio, which was, catenaccio means a big chain, the kind of chain that you put across your door to ensure that nobody can break into your house. And so it was all about...
Very Italian.
Yes. All about not conceding a goal. So if you're John Charles and you're top scorer,
who was an attacker, who was wonderful centre forward,
and you are regularly scoring in those conditions, it means you are venerated in a way that if you play in leagues which are really back and forth, up and down, where there are lots of goals, maybe someone like John Charles gets a little bit lost in that. Instead, where goals are at more and more of a premium than anywhere on the planet, and for him to be as prolific as he did really set him apart. He played with this great Argentine player called Omar Sivori, who was this proto-Maradona figure from Argentina. I was in Argentina in April, and I went to watch River Plate Boca at the Monumental. And there is a stand, which is the Sivori stand. And Juventus, Gianni Agnelli paid so much money for Omar Sivori that River Plate were able to make the Monumental the biggest stadium, I think.
I've been to that stadium.
Yeah, and so for John Charles to get to play with Omar Sivori, who I'm not sure whether he actually makes the 100.
I don't think he does. And Charles was known as the gentle giant. Not even nasty Italian defenders brought out his bad side, I'm assuming. What about the Van Basten, a later period in that great Milan side, perhaps certainly one of the great club sides in history? What, they won the European Cup 2 or 3 times in a row.
Yeah, and certainly I think one of the most stylistically accomplished forwards ever to play the game. And someone, because of his association with that AC Milan side, which I think World Soccer voted, Arrigo Sacchi always loves to bring this up, was voted the greatest club side of all time because of the pressing style of play, which kind of entered football into a new modern period in the same way that Pep Guardiola's Barcelona did. Van Basten enabled AC Milan to play that style of football. And I think there are two strikers, Andrew, over the last 40 years that Italians have a great respect for and say are the best ever strikers to play in their league, or best ever strikers in that generation. And the two of them are Marco van Basten and the Brazilian Ronaldo. Those are the two players that in that really defensive league, which we've talked about, these Hall of Fame defenders like Paolo Maldini, like Franco Baresi, they will talk about Marco van Basten in training, in their case, in Baresi and Maldini's case, or in the Milan derbies that they played against Ronaldo. For those two, the three best players they played against in that era would be Maradona, Van Basten, and Ronaldo.
And Van Basten scored one of the most remarkable of all World Cup goals. Finally, James, Italian football sometimes has a negative quality in the sense that some of the great players in history have gone there, failed, and then made their careers elsewhere. My favorite player of all time, Jimmy Greaves, of course, spent a very unhappy year in Milan. Dennis Law as well. Italian football was so central in the history of world football. What is it about guys like Greaves and Law, in contrast with John Charles, that made them fail in Italy and yet go elsewhere and become, of course, iconic footballers? Law at Manchester United, Greaves at Tottenham.
So I think it's strangely, it's culture. I mean, you would think that moving to Italy would be the best thing, you know, like great food, great wine, great places to live. Instead, for I think Jimmy Greaves, it was a case of, well, what am I doing here? Because all we do is train, and then before games, we have to go and stay in a hotel, which is like monastic. In terms of conditions, can't go out and party, can't just relax. The pressure's always on, and I think for a lot of players, and this is still something to this day, it is such a culture shock. The way Italian football teams prepare for games, this idea that you're not only expected at the training ground when you're not playing, but on the night before the game. You have to stay in a hotel. You're away from your family a lot more than you are in English football. And
so no sex before games, James.
well, it depends on how creative you were about.
I'm sure that the what is it, the divine ponytail had ways of getting out of the hotel.
Well, Roberto is married to his childhood sweetheart from his
good.
But yeah.
So, finally, James, Michael Cox suggested, even if he's an Arsenal fan, that he thought Jimmy Greaves probably was the greatest English footballer in history. Do you agree, James?
I mean, given you've told me he's your favorite player, Andrew, I will say.
Well, you don't have to agree with me. You can disagree. Who do you think should be? I think on the list, there's someone, I think Moore might be higher. Oh, Bobby Charlton, who's a bit boring, but who's your top English? I mean, given that you grew up in Hull, I don't suppose there's any Hull players, but who's your top English player on the Soccer 100?
My top
Greaves or Charlton or Banks or Moore?
I would say Moore.
Well, you're Italian. You only like the defenders, James.
Yeah, but I think there's something so magnificent about that game against Brazil in 1970. I don't know. I don't know whether it's the color photographs, Andrew, of just like and the respect between Moore and Pele, and the respect between Pele and Banks, which is.
Yeah, and even though he got stitched up more in that jewelry shop.
Yes, but it's
and the save from Banks again, the header.
Yeah, but it's I don't know whether that's because it's the only generation of winning England players that elevates them. But yeah, I think the photography of them in 1970.
Yeah, although you could make the argument, James, that if Banks hadn't got I mean, it's a good argument. If Banks hadn't got injured for the quarterfinal and played instead of Bonetti, England would have beaten Germany.
Yes.
And then you wouldn't have had that remarkable semi-final between Germany and Italy, one of the most famous of all World Cup games. Anyway, enough, James. We've talked for too long. I've kept you for too long. Wonderful conversation. You are the most Italian of men from Hull. You're my Roberto. You are my, not my Dino Zoff. You're my Roberto Baggio of Hull. Congratulations on the book. It's out now. The Soccer 100, a celebration of the greatest players in the sport's history. It's a wonderful read. It's written by Oliver Kay and James Horncastle, with lots of contributors from The Athletic. Congratulations, James. And if we're ever in Italy together, we'll have to go to a game. Thank you so much.
Thank you.